Hello, friends. Welcome to Between Two Sermons. It's me, and this time my guest, or my partner, I should say, is Kelly Fassolt, our outreach director, not John Amayo. But it's kind of appropriate, Kelly, that you're here because of the nature of our subject. We're in 1 Peter chapter 3. Friends, that was what the sermon was on, called A New Lifestyle, part 2. But we're talking about husbands and wives. So, Kelly, welcome to our Between Two Sermons.
Oh, thanks, Rob. It's an honor to be here. And I really appreciate our conversations we've had already on this topic, on these verses. And I think that what you are sharing is really significant and relatable and applicable to all of our relationships and how we show up in all of our various contexts.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know you and I were having a longer talk walking over about husbands and wives, and do we still, as Christians today, some people would take, the Bible talks about husbands and wives in a few places, of course, but this one maybe is kind of a little more, I don't know, old school or concrete in a way, or I don't know what the right word I'm thinking of is, could be more open to misinterpretation.
Absolutely.
So, Sarah calls Abraham Lord and submit and all. It's a little stronger.
Yes.
But I think back to what you just said is so important to point out. It's, what if you're not married, or what if you have a different view of marriage? This passage is really not about marriage. Marriage is the relationship that's being used to talk about a deeper theological truth.
Yeah.
So let's stop there. And that deeper theological truth, as we were saying even earlier, in the very opening verse, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, when wives are addressed, and then a lot is said about wives. And then chapter 7 or verse 7 when husbands are addressed. In both of those cases, I'm sure it's very intentional. Peter says, wives in the same way,
yes.
Husbands in the same way.
Yeah.
Now, if you didn't read chapter 2, you wouldn't know what he was talking about.
Right.
But knowing what's behind those few words means everything.
Absolutely.
And what he means there is, in this relationship, husband and wife, but I think the Bible would say in all relationships, parent, children. Paul, when he does the household calls, will talk about kids, and in Colossians, same thing when he talks about relationships, how social relationships are the place where the gospel is worked out. He talks about people even in their jobs, wherever you do, who work in such a way as if you're working for Christ. So I think it's very important, as you suggest, that these that we see the marriage relationship as just a key relationship to which we are supposed to, in the same way as Jesus lived through difficulty. In the specifics, as I remember, were, Jesus did not retaliate when people were in his face. He did not match insult for insult. Those are just two examples.
Yeah.
And Jesus, instead, it says, entrusted himself to him who judges justly. A Bible's way of saying he decided, instead of reacting, responding, maybe threatening back, he said, I'm going to trust God and take my hits, not for hits' sake, but as a way to demonstrate the deeper quality of my faith. And what Peter is saying here, even though he is addressing wives for most of this passage, he's saying, live this way, this Jesus way, in such a way so that you can influence people that are watching you, who see a sort of a quality of life that seems to be counterintuitive, or not matching up with the situation where you should retaliate, you should demand your rights, whatever the case may be. So that's a great point.
Yeah. Yeah, well, one of the things that I have really appreciated as I've been looking at this passage in this series is just how Peter in this passage is addressing societal power.
Yeah.
And you've used the word subversively.
Yeah.
And that's something that, I attended seminary. That was something that really was, it really impacted me in my studies, is how Jesus shows up for the vulnerable, how he's always gone for the marginalized, and the subversive nature of his love throughout the scriptures and, for us today.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Do you want to speak a little bit more about the subversive
I think,
aspect of this?
Yes. In fact, I think I mentioned this in the sermon, but it's right to your point. If you look at both of the sermons the last 2 weeks back to back, or the passage, from the middle of chapter 2 to the near end of chapter 3, where we are today, or this Sunday, he talks about a series of people. But the people he chooses in the order he chooses, I don't think are a mistake. Starts with slaves, then he goes to women, then he goes to men. So that tells you something. He's not just doing that willy-nilly. He's being purposefully showing how the gospel, we've all heard this term, many of us, as the upside down kingdom, where he's saying God's ways are not our ways. And God, back to your point, is not only values vulnerability, but he's saying the way power is understood in the world, you might say is a good way of thinking about it, as you brought that word up. When Jesus says, or excuse me, the Isaiah says about God, my ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Another way of saying that is God does not see the power dynamics in the world or the world itself in the same way that you and I do. I've said this in other sermons, even in this series, we tend to want to be around people who will make our lives look better. I'm talking about, socioeconomics, education, whatever the case may be. Yeah. So that's kind of your normal human nature. You don't need to be taught to want to be in the in crowd, or to want more of power in school or in business or in whatever. But the gospel in many ways inverts that. And so I think it inverts it, one, in the sense of he says, I'm going to start with slaves. I'm going to start at the bottom and talk about how even slaves can demonstrate the same kind of Christ-like quality that anyone can, and they can be influencers. Then to women, which in this society, maybe less so in ours is far from perfect, but less so in ours, were seen as people that were also had less power. Yeah. And then he ends up with husbands, and even in the husband's case, in that one verse, he does challenge them. Yeah. It's a power word, but in this case, he's saying you need to you need to be deferential.
Yeah, respect
and
women.
Respect, even I think in some translations they'll say honor instead of the word respect. And I remember reading somewhere it said the word honor there, also translated respect, is used of precious metals, in that he's trying to say you need to. It says a co-heir with you in the grace of God or something. Yeah. So that he's, even in those few words, it doesn't hit us the same way today, as I guess, but he's saying, I want you to see your wife in ways that the society does not see her in Peter's day, as someone who is fully made in the image of God, just like you are, who has all the rights and privilege, etc., and is your partner. Your co-heir. Yeah. And if you don't do that, okay, this is where it gets a little interesting. Your prayers are going to be hindered. In other words, I take that very seriously. Yeah. So I think all of it in that way is subversive. Maybe is a good word. God says, I don't see things the way that you do. And at the heart of the Christian gospel is this freedom and liberation that says, even that verse in Galatians, it says, there is no more bond nor free nor slave or male nor female. Yeah. We are all one in Christ. He's not eliminating those distinctions, de facto, but he's saying when it comes to position and power and privilege, we're all, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. Yeah. So I think that is a powerful thing.
It is.
And I think that the essence of, or the challenge of this passage and in this section of Scripture is to say, are those this reimagining of power, is it being demonstrated in your relationships?
Yeah.
So yes, husbands and wives happen to be the subject. This passage, slaves and masters were the last passage. Those are two important kinds of relationships.
Yeah.
But the main point, I think the overarching point, is not so much even marriage or slavery, is relationships.
Yeah.
That if I really want to know if my faith is being lived out and is stronger today than it was yesterday, is how well is it showing up in my close relationships?
Yeah, that's so good. And I think in that context, that's where the inequity was very apparent, right? And so those are really pointed examples that make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I would say, as a contemporary woman, reading that passage, directing wives, and commending Sarah for, calling Abraham Lord, if you will, and referring to women as the weaker partner or whatnot, can be very challenging and even offensive if misunderstood. Yeah. And we were talking just a moment ago about how over time, understanding the scriptures at a deeper level, you come to understand it more accurately.
Yeah.
And for, you referenced in the same way being a reference to Christ. And to me, that's huge, because if you think about, well, who is Jesus? Jesus is God.
Yeah.
He is actually the one who has all authority, all power, and should have all honor and respect. Yeah. And yet his example is how he submitted for the sake of others.
That's right. Well
said.
And
in faith to God.
Yeah.
Although he's part of that Godhead, committing faith in their plan and in their love and their mission. Yeah. And so to me, who am I to say that's beneath me?
Yeah.
Right? Christ was a beautiful example.
This passage, it's not the only one of its kind, is a very much a challenge to, yes, we don't have the same mindset and expectations about relationships or other things as they did in the first century. I think that's an easy thing to admit. But in either case, whether I lived in Peter's day or in our day, this challenge in the same way is very difficult and counterintuitive and countercultural.
Yes.
So, for us to see our relationships, husband, wife, employer, employee, whatever the case, there's many ways, parent, child, Paul will talk about that in Ephesians chapter 4, or wherever it is. So he or 6. But the point is, he's saying you need to see the way in which you relate to other people, okay? The way you show up and maybe serve or respond to criticism, all these different things. How you demonstrate your faith or how you live ought to be a demonstration of your faith. And that's in many ways, it is counterintuitive. It is going to be, not seen as the way the world works. Mm-hmm. And even in those two examples of Jesus and threat, he did not make threats or retaliate. Just those two simple examples. There's could be many more. That's very normal. I mean, if someone was doing to me what they did to Jesus, I think I would want to retaliate. Yeah. So Jesus is a hard act to follow, but he's trying to say Christ ought to be changing me and you really at the core of our being. And it's going to be demonstrated, not so much because we fill in the blanks on a test or we affirm doctrines, which are important to do, but how those truths are lived out in our lives.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think this passage elevates the vulnerable, and I would say, and elevates those that feel that they're in situations that are unequal and that they're powerless to change. The slave and the wife was in that context, in that culture, were powerless to necessarily to change the system and to be valued differently by society.
Yeah.
I also think there's another application which is addressed here because it's talking about the unbelieving husband, which is how do we show up to people who are resistant to the gospel and who are disinterested in faith, and how do we demonstrate the love of Christ with our lives rather than expecting them to be won over just by what we say.
Yeah, no, I think, maybe this is a good final application for this message in our talk, or our time anyway. It is unique. It says, this is all paraphrasing, I don't have that in front of me, but, wives, live this way, even if your husband does not obey the word or whatever, the implication is they're not a Christian. So it's a real situation, and this could go both ways, but in other words, you're the person at the other side of the table, your friend, your spouse, is not a believer. And in some cases, they're not even interested in hearing. We all have friends like that.
Yeah.
And it says, but they can be won over without the word. I don't know if that's the exact words. By these, again, a paraphrase, the inner beauty or the inner truth or your reverence for God.
Yeah.
And so those are powerful lessons.
Yeah.
And it's saying to me that my life is a witness. Of course, even later in chapter 3, Peter will say a famous verse, be always ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you about the hope within you. So they talk about words.
Yeah.
But, in many cases, we don't have the opportunity for words. And he's saying maybe even more important is how your faith is demonstrated without words. So I think it's a great challenge for us, an encouragement for us to ask ourselves that question. That, I think, is at the core of what's being said here, because Peter ultimately wants to talk about, even in chapter 4, serving. In other words, how are we showing the world, telling the world, sharing with the world, and reaching the world?
Yeah.
And it's going to be not through pamphlets.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's not going to be through, legislation. It's going to be because we're living our lives in a different way.
Yes. So caring for people, especially in their need or vulnerability.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think our time is up.
Okay.
And thanks for
Thank
including me.
Thanks for being here and being a part of this conversation. And we'll see you all next week on Between Two Sermons.